Gracious God, we pour out our praise, knowing that it is in you and through you that our life, our words, our actions, that it's in you we find our meaning. I pray this in your holy name. Amen. So consider this part 2 of last week's message. Last week we focused on the Beatitudes, and this kind of comes right at the heel of that part of the scriptures. And again, in this passage, we're faced with a similar temptation as we had last week. And that temptation is to hear Jesus' words as a requirement of your value versus a blessing. Right? So Jesus here again is going to speak a blessing, a commissioning, let's say, instead of a command. So take note in this passage. If you want to turn in your Bible, it's Matthew chapter 5, verses 13 through 20. Or if you're on your iPhone, you can do that there too as well. Jesus is not saying in this passage, if you want to become salt and light, do these things. Nor does he say, before I call you salt and light, I need to see this from you. Rather, simply and directly, Jesus says, you are the salt of the earth. You are the light of the world. It's just like with last week's Beatitudes, sheer blessing, commendation, affirmation, commissioning. So as a recap from last week's message, I want to remind us that psychologists suggest that for every negative message elementary-aged children hear about themselves, they need to hear 10 positive ones to restore their sense of self-esteem where it had been previously. Right? Every negative message to be just simply brought back to baseline requires 10 positive messages. Now, I looked all week to see what this was in adolescence, because my thought is if it's 1 to 10 in elementary age, it's like 1 to 200 in adolescence. And in that space, you get so many more negative personal messages. I'm not sure where it goes in adulthood, but I would be willing to bet it's still at least 1 to 10. So to put it another way, children become what they're named. So call a child bad long enough, that child will begin to behave badly. Call a child or a teen or adult, for that matter, worthless or unlovable or shameful, and eventually he or she, all of us, will live into the names we've been assigned. So in the same way, if you call us good or useful or dependable or helpful or worthwhile, we grow into that identity. Now, I don't think Paul knew the psychology of this, but I think Paul had learned from personal experience that it was much better to call the people of faith saints than sinners. That the attributes and the livelihood that you got from saintliness over our sinliness is profound. So I want you to think back on this week or last week or maybe this month, the last time that you saw a Christian or a church in the news. Anybody got one in their head? Got it, the picture, the last time you saw it? I'd be willing to bet that for most of us in this room, that probably wasn't a good thing. If I had to bet, it might have been one of the last few weeks where you might have seen a report about our Southern Baptist brothers and sisters denomination and all of the kind of hidden secrets that were kept back. Or one of the multitude of Christian leaders caught in an abuse scandal. It's a mess. I think it's a mess because when we contrast the state of the church and the state of faith in comparison to what Jesus is saying here in Matthew chapter 5, we feel a discrepancy, right? We feel it in our bones. We feel that something isn't quite right. In a book called Unchristian by prominent evangelical authors David Kinnaman and Gabe Lyons, they spend the entire book arguing that the church has earned the perception that we're judgmental, we're anti-homosexual, we're hypocritical, we're seen in a bad way by our neighbors, and it's affecting the kingdom around us. Their argument is that part of the reason we have so many nuns, and by nuns I don't mean N-U-N, I mean N-O-N-E, right? People who claim when asked, are you a person of faith? They check the box, none. That box has grown by 60% in the last decade. And part of their construct that they're arguing in their book Unchristian is that we've done this by how we've behaved as the church. That people are choosing to name themselves as unchristian rather than put themselves in our camp. Now, here's the fascinating part about that. When those same people are interviewed on whether or not they believe in Jesus, the numbers are radically different. Most of them still say, I believe in Jesus, I just won't take this name Christian. Matthew 5:13, verses 13 through 16 says this in a different translation so you can hear it differently. You're the salt of the earth, but if salt has lost its taste, how shall its saltiness be restored? It's no longer good for anything except to be thrown out or trampled under people's feet. You are the light of the world. A city on a hill cannot be hidden. Nor do people light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a stand, and it gives light to all in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father who is in heaven. Jesus here tells his followers that they are salt and light. He tells us that we are salt and light. Now, the first thing that we have to point out as we're reading this text is look at verse 13 in the very first word or in the very first sentence. We read this word, you. You are the salt of the earth. Now, as a person who reads English regularly, when I think about you, the hard part about the English language is that you means you. It's one person, or I can say you. And here in the Greek, Jesus is saying, not you, but y'all, right? Those of us who come from the South know this word. It's a much more useful word. We should have somebody commission a Southern translation of the Bible because sometimes it's more helpful in aligning with the Greek. Here, Jesus says if we were to read that translation in the Southern gospel, y'all are the salt of the earth. But if salt loses its taste, how shall its saltiness be restored? Y'all are the light of the world. Each verb and person named in this is actually plural. See, here, Jesus is painting a picture for us that we're in this together, right? Ever been to a city with one person? It's not very fun. Right? Cities are us. And Jesus is looking out over this mountainside and he's talking to just regular folk like us. Regular folk sitting in a room and he's saying, you, the people who often aren't seen as having any value in the kingdoms of this world, You're God's plan. Collectively. And salt is about an inner composition. Salt preserves meat's internal integrity, right? For us, not only is salt about tastiness, salt lifts flavors, right? When you add salt to a dish, you've heard me preach a sermon on this before, when you add salt to a dish, it amplifies the flavor. I had a meal this week that was unbelievable, and I had this sea scallop that had this squid ink shell over the top of it, and then they poured in a beurre blanc sauce with caviar over the... I can still taste it. And the saltiness that caviar added to the dish made everything taste like heaven. This is what Jesus is proclaiming over his people. You are the saltiness that adds the flavor into the world. You make people taste better. But not only that, you preserve them. You hold them into being. Salt is about this inner composition, bringing out our flavors and making us last. And light is about this outward display. When light shines, it pushes darkness back, helping everyone to see better. So together, salt and light prevent decay and add flavor and dispel darkness. And this is what Jesus names us to be. Inwardly transformed by his love. And as a result, becoming a tasty city on a hill. This becomes even clearer in verse 16. In the same way, let y'all's light shine before others, so that they may see your good works and give glory to y'all's Father in heaven. Now here, the word for good in the Greek, there's two words for goodness in the Greek. One means like high quality. But here, Matthew uses the word beautiful. Beautiful. Your beautiful works. The things that you do that add beauty to our world. See, Jesus is naming that we have the resources through him to draw near to God and to be filled with his joy in the midst of even the most negative of circumstances. We can't forget that the people who were sitting on the side of this mountain listening to Jesus were under the captivity of Rome. Their lives were not great all the time. The average lifespan was somewhere around the age of 50. So, Jesus is naming in the midst of even our negative circumstances that the light and life of God courses through us and spreads from us to the world around us. So how can I be a blessing here? How can we lift others up? How can we encourage? How can we bring Jesus' beautiful kingdom around us? I was struck this week about our Young Life partners in the Ukraine, who in the midst of war, these young adults have chosen to stay, to feed and to house and to protect and to care for their neighbors. There's this beauty that's emanating from them. There's this understanding that part of their job in this world is to preserve the lives of their neighbors, even in the most difficult of circumstances. Another example is following worship today. I don't know if you know this or not, but most shelters and food opportunities for our homeless brothers and sisters and folks in our community are closed on July 4th. And so if people don't have food, they have to figure it out. So our Trinity team has committed and is inviting us to go downtown in Walnut Creek and to share a meal, to barbecue for our homeless brothers and sisters and provide a bridge to bridge the gap of food services within our community. This is real tastiness that our community is doing within our neighborhood. Now, this is all great, but Jesus is also very realistic in this passage. Because he says, if salt loses its taste, how is saltiness restored? It's no longer good for anything except kind of be trampled on the ground. And if I'm being honest, I'd say Jesus' picture of unsaltiness here describes American Christianity and American church way too much. And Jesus is calling us in the exact opposite direction. He's calling us to lay down our selfishness and be transformed by his selflessness. To operate with a whole different set of priorities, to be people who don't get caught up in panic and anxiety because of the kingdoms of this world, but instead make and create peace within the kingdom of this world. To be a people who embody deep contentment in God, and we don't look to bank accounts or romance or politics to be our hope, because we will not find it there. To be a people who embody a completely different way of life, a way that unifies instead of divides. Jesus intends for our saltiness to transform the world. Now, you might be skeptical here. And be like, really? Like, this is Jesus' plan? Jesus expects me to change the world? I just want some coffee. But remember who he's talking to. Again, he's not talking to the rich and the powerful and the elite who can go out and just buy the kingdom. He's talking to average folk around the Sea of Galilee. Skye Janthe says it this way: this isn't that he expected each person to change the world through remarkable accomplishments. Rather, Jesus expected his undistinguished followers to be the source of the world's most essential ingredients. Pliny says this. He lived in the first century. He said, there is nothing more useful in this world than salt and sunshine. Likewise, in a dark and deteriorating world, there is nothing more wonderful than simple people living as Jesus taught. The world doesn't need more ambitious Christians. Our world desperately needs ordinary lives lived in rich communion with God and with each other. One of my favorite pastors that I have read everything he's ever written and literally soak up anything I can is Eugene Peterson. Now, you might only know him as the person who translated the Message. But if that's all you know about Eugene Peterson, my only challenge for you this week is to go buy any other book he's written. Now, Eugene is fascinating because his entire life he was a person who could have anything he wanted as a pastor. Prestige, power. In fact, one day, Bono, if you don't know who Bono is, look that up too, but Bono is the lead singer of U2. One day, Bono wants to have a meeting with Eugene Peterson, and Eugene tells him, I'm busy translating right now, I don't have time, let's schedule something at another time. Bono. Because Eugene understood who and what he was on this planet to do. He was a shepherd, and he had a community of faith that he pastored for generations. He just loved them. He wasn't trying to have a national stage. He wasn't trying to do anything remarkable in that place. And at one point, somebody asked him, if you knew today you were going to be writing your last sermon, what would you say to your church? And Peterson replied, I think I would want to talk about things that are immediate and ordinary. In the kind of world we live in, the primary way that I can get people to be aware of God is to say, who are you going to have breakfast with tomorrow? How are you going to treat that person? So if it was my last sermon, I guess I'd want to say, go home and be good to your spouse. Treat your children with respect. Do a good job at work. See, Peterson is right. We need to be people of salt and light in a real world, and that involves genuinely being real people, listening to them well, treating others well, treating them as little images of God as they actually are. And I think along the way, we're going to be surprised now and then at who God brings into our lives. We'll discover that sometimes the most moral thing to do is the one thing that's going to cause other people to call you immoral or loosey-goosey. If you don't believe me, watch Jesus. Over and over and over, Jesus is walking through life, constantly interrupted. Anybody hate interruptions? Jesus constantly interrupted. His ministry was a ministry of interruptions. Everywhere you look, he's going to a place and people stop him from going to that place. And he's like, give me just a second. And he pays attention. As he's going, he's just paying attention and he's listening and he's hearing. And sometimes people are eating and doing things on the Sabbath that they're not supposed to do. And he says, that's not what the Sabbath's for. Go ahead. And sometimes people are holding rules above the love and life of humanity. And he's like, that's actually not what that rule means. And this next section of this text is messy because Jesus says, all of the law and the prophets are right on. I'm not coming to abolish them. I'm coming to fulfill them. And then he spends the next 20 verses saying, well, you've heard it said this, but I say this. He's doing the hard work, right? And he's looking at these people and he's saying, this is what it really means to live in the way of the kingdom. Some of you are wonderful neighbors. You bring people together, you check in on people. Your neighborliness would be missed if you were gone. Y'all are the salt and the light. Some of you hold positions of leadership and authority in your job and in the community, and you use your power to serve. You do the best for the most people and try to accomplish your goals without using people. Y'all are the salt and the light of the world. Some of you are incredibly generous with your resources. Your home is open. Your money and things are shared. You resist the temptation to close your hands, and the power of God's Spirit uses you regularly. You're the salt and light. You got a salty wallet. Some of you are parents with providing both emotional and mental support and love and respect for your children. And you're building up and you're growing your families. You are salt and light. Some of you are steeped into adoption and foster care situations. Some of you have helped other parents in hard situations. Some of you have volunteered hundreds of hours in our own children's program here at St. Matthew. You are salt and light. Some of you have been married for ages. Happy anniversary. You're salt and light. You figured out how to show us how to live together. And some of you have stepped into really messy relationships. And you're helping hold each side of that relationship up and adding support. You are salt and light. Some of you are slowly overcoming your anger problems and your anxiety problems or your drinking problems. You're salt and light. And some of you are helping people overcome in those places. And you too are salt and light. See, there's a cumulative effect when people look and begin to realize that God is really at work in our midst in the daily ordinary, in the ordinary sacred space, in these thin spaces of our life where God crosses over into our moments. See, our goal is for all of us to grow in such a way that after a while our neighbors notice and can't explain it away. Now, that's a long game. Some of you are like, what's your plan, Rustin, for growth? This is it. I want to love people so much that they come into these doors or don't come into these doors. I want to love them so much that they can't help but know that God cares for them too. That's it. That's the plan. And it's not a me, it's a we. It's a y'all. The only way this happens is through the ordinary sacred. Now, I think some of us struggle with seeing the ordinariness of light and salt within our faith journeys. And we think, I'm not doing anything for the kingdom. Yeah, you are. So here's my challenge this week. I want you to start a salt and light log. Start a salt and light log. And any time that God's worked through you to help somebody else, just write it down. Just write it down. Just put it, don't write a whole story. Just write down, God used me to work through this. My kids are a mess. God used me to keep the chaos from spilling into the street. My marriage is messy. God kept us together one more week. I didn't take a drink this week. God help me. I was able to help my neighbor mow their yard and take care of a few things. Just a simple log. These aren't magic things. These are ordinary things. Where the salt and light of Christ adds beauty to our world. Amen.